Hello again. I was hoping this time to be showing you how to overhaul the Morini rocker assemblies, but I'm having trouble sourcing suitable bushes to rebush the rockers, and the bushes I have now got need very carefully machined rocker shafts to go with them, and then they need hardening, and I haven't got around to doing that yet. So instead I thought I'd show you how to dismantle the somewhat infamous Morini electric starter motor. Now eventually they did re-engineer the engine quite considerably to put a front-mounted starter motor driving through a gear system. But this is the original setup, introduced in about 1978, that put a drum on the side of the alternator rotor, which was engaged by a centrifugal clutch mechanism driven via a chain from what for all the world looks like a giant windscreen wiper motor. Now these can be made to work reliably, but they do need a very good battery. My 500 Say that I sold to a friend doesn't even have a kickstarter lever fitted, and quite often gets comments it shows about, you can't possibly have the electric starter motor working reliably, can you? At which point it has to be fired up to prove that they do indeed work and can work very well. Now these motors have an oil-filled gearbox, and on the end you will see the rubber fill plug and a level plug. Now quite often these haven't been filled with oil, and it should be EP70 is what according to the manual, but you should check that it's an oil that is compatible with bronze or brass materials, because the worm wheel that drives the output shaft is indeed bronze, and certain oils can attack it. The sealing arrangements aren't the best in terms of keeping oil out of the starter motor, so you really don't want to have one standing up like this. Ideally you only want to keep it this way up when it's in side casing. It's this kind of orientation and the oil levels down here somewhere, but they do tend to leak oil into the body of the motor, and that combined with the carbon dust from the brushes gums up the internals of the motor. The brushes stick and then they stop working. Now sometimes they get burned out because people keep on trying with an old battery to get them to crank, but if they're not cranking properly, you check the battery, check the starter solenoid, then you start looking at the brush gear and servicing it. So to take one of these motors apart, you've first of all got two screws that hold the brush gear into the end casing, and these must be removed first. Of course it does help if you've given the exterior of the motor a very thorough clean before you start. But even so, once I get inside, I shall be putting some gloves on. Then you've got two long through bolts, which are 8mm. I already broke these earlier, so they turn easily. Okay, that's all the fasteners out. Now at this point you need to possibly tap the housing to get everything apart. So I'm going to remount this in the vise, change the camera setup, and we'll continue from there. Okay, the lighting conditions aren't the best, but I hope you can see what's going on. There's a nice raised ridge on the end cap, and I've got a cold chisel here that's had the nose nicely rounded over to use as a drift. What I'm trying to do is actually hold the steel body on and tap the cap off. And that's it. We've broken it. You might need to do it from the other side as well. Sometimes it'll be a tighter fit onto the bearing, but now we're starting to see some of the claggy carbon inside, and I'm going to put a pair of gloves on. Okay, we can now, if the body hasn't already broken from the gearbox housing, you can give it a little tap to pull it off, and you can hold the armature in, slide the motor body off. This is the point at which great big gobs of sticky carbon can fall out. Now if you see here, you can see this brush is extended, the others aren't, and that one's free in its housing, but these are due to the amount of goo or yeah, I mean that one's really stiff, so those wouldn't have been making proper contact with the commutator, and this starter motor came to me in a box as being a non-functional one. Now the armature shaft should then just pull out of the gearbox, and it drives with a flat drive on the end. And if you look at the commutator here, I'll pull it back onto the white hardboard later and you can have a better look, but you can see it's quite black. But apart from that, the armature looks really quite nice and should clean up okay, and we'll have a functional starter motor again. So I'm just going to take another pause and change the setup again. Okay, this is actually the motor off the 500 that you saw me doing the rocker stud repair on, and is, if anything, in worse condition than the other motor, though it did actually, believe it or not, briefly try to crank. Now if I remove the little insulating band here, you can see a huge, great big chunks of gunged up carbon falling off it, and the commutator really is in a pretty gunged up state. I can't see any copper on there, so that'll get all cleaned up, washed out, a new bearing installed, the brushes will get cleaned. If the brushes are under length, I'll source some replacement brushes. Really is horrible in there. Now the other component on these motors that causes trouble is the gearbox, and here's the one I've got apart. So there's a circlip holds this bearing in, and you can see the worm drive driven by the motor. This is really quite a nice part. It's precision ground steel, and these don't seem to give trouble. You can see the drive that makes up with the motor shaft. The only thing that keeps the gearbox oil out of the motor is in fact the bearing, and this is just a double row ball race with ordinary seals, and they really only designed to stop the grease from the bearing leaking out, and they're not the best things in the world for stopping oil gradually, as particularly as these wear, finding its way into the motor. As for the gearbox itself, I don't know if you can see in that. I think you just can. You can see the bronze. See if I can get this a bit closer and some light in it. Yeah, there we go. You can see the bronze worm wheel, and the one in here is actually quite badly worn. And they are available as a replacement part from North Leicester Motorcycles. I mean, this one, it's probably still usable for a while, but it's really sort of false economy to keep going as it is. I'll order one up and change that out. Maybe do a sequence on pressing it all apart. But if your worm gear is good, and the bearing right at the back there, that's usually good because it's in oil. If that's all good, you should just be able to clean it all up, reassemble, and have a functioning starter motor again, and in conjunction with a good starter motor, have an electric start Morini, just like Morini intended. They did, by the way, towards the end of production of the Roadsters, the 500s had a 26 amp hour battery to try and get enough cranking amps. But installing one of the modern AGM high cranking amp batteries is a better solution. I fitted a 13 amp hour Hawker Odyssey to the 500 Say, which is about half the size of the original battery. Made up a whole new battery tray for it, and those are spec'd for things like 1400 Harleys, so they have no trouble at all, even with this rather primitive starter motor setup. They're cranking and starting Morinis. Well, that's all for now.